The wind screamed through the open door of the C-47 Skytrain, a metallic shriek that drowned out even the thunder of anti-aircraft fire ripping through the night sky. Below, the coastline of Normandy wasn't a map. It was a living nightmare of tracer rounds and searchlights probing the clouds. Inside the fuselage, the men of the 101st and 82nd Airborne, their faces blackened with burnt cork, weren't just jumping into occupied France. They were dropping into absolute darkness, into flooded marshes deliberately designed to swallow them whole. Their mission was chaos. Their supply lines were the weight on their backs, soon to be lost in the bocage. But in their minds, tucked beneath the prayer books and the photographs of sweethearts, was an unspoken, unwritten directive. It wasn't in the official field manuals. It was whispered in the staging areas of England, a grim nod between seasoned sergeants and green lieutenants. The order was simple, savage, and heavily overlooked by history. Survival was paramount, and the enemy was not to be a liability. The first waves of the liberation were about to turn the Norman countryside into a silent, efficient reckoning, where quarter was a luxury no one could afford. The planners of Operation Overlord had drawn up the greatest invasion in human history on infinite reams of paper. Every bullet, every bandage, every K-ration seemed accounted for. But Dwight Eisenhower and his commanders knew a terrifying secret. The wall of charts and logistics was a fantasy. The moment the ramp dropped on a Higgins boat or a parachute blossomed in the night, the mathematical precision would collapse into primal survival. The objective was to punch through Hitler's Atlantic Wall, but the silent directive that spread through the ranks was a different kind of warfare. It was a shadow strategy, born not of high command mandates, but of battlefield necessity. To cross Europe, these men would first have to erase the immediate threat ahead of them with a terrifying finality. The official history speaks of bravery and liberation. The unspoken history speaks of a brutal, streamlined logic. If the enemy stood between you and the next hedgerow, you did not slow down for a captive escort. You ensured the threat was permanently neutralized. As the Armada crossed the English Channel, the sea heaved with a sickening violence. Men retched into paper bags and their own helmets, the stench of fuel and illness mixing into a nauseating paste. When the ramps finally dropped on Omaha Beach, the illusion of a quick, clean fight evaporated in the red haze of the surf. The first waves exiting the landing craft were met not by a manageable beachhead, but by a fierce, interlocking field of MG-42 machine gun fire. The sound was unmistakable. Hitler's buzzsaw, ripping through metal and armor at 100-200 rounds per minute. Men vanished instantly, their bodies torn apart before their feet could find purchase on the sand. The beach was a cacophony of absolute shock. The official plan had called for a systematic clearing of German Widerstandsnest resistance nests. But for the men pinned beneath the shingle, a low wall of smooth stones offering the only cover, the plan was gone. The unspoken directive took hold. Capturing prisoners in the strike zone was an impossibility. The only way to silence the concrete bunker's spitting fire was to destroy them utterly. Sweeping the defenders aside with grenades, satchel charges, and flamethrowers until the firing stopped. For the paratroopers scattered miles inland, the isolation was a different breed of horror. Men landed alone, dangling from church steeples in Sainte-Mère-Église, or plunging into chest-deep, man-made marshes where the weight of their combat equipment dragged them under. Robert Freitag, a young lieutenant with the 101st, didn't land in a drop zone. He landed in a nightmare of high hedgerows and pitch-black fields where the boundaries between friend and foe had collapsed. The click of a cricket, the metallic child's toy used as a challenge signal, was the only sound that pierced the dread. Without lines, without officers, and deep behind enemy lines, small clusters of lost Americans quickly realized they could not afford the luxury of the Geneva Conventions. A prisoner meant a guard detail, noise, and a high probability of a recapture attempt. In the flooded fields behind Utah Beach, the logic of the Dark Order festered. An enemy soldier who surrendered could suddenly shout a warning, turn on his captor, or slow the advance through the strike zone. The unspoken protocol that evening was blunt. Speed was survival, and silence was victory. The threat had to be cleared, quickly and completely, leaving no chance for a bullet in the back. This moral fog thickened in the labyrinth of the Norman hedgerows. By mid-morning on June 6th, the scattered airborne units began coalescing into ad hoc combat teams. A mix of pathfinders, stranded glider pilots, and infantrymen cut off from their mother units. Their target was the vital crossroads behind the German lines. But their immediate reality was the Bocage country. A claustrophobic quilt of sunken lanes and earthen banks crowned with dense, thousand-year-old hedges. Every corner was a potential ambush. The official after-action reports would later sanitize the violence as mopping up operations. But the men who fought through those fields understood the grim terminology. Clearing a hedgerow did not mean taking salutes and gathering names for a processing center that didn't exist. It meant a cascade of silent bayonet work and close-quarters demolition. Soldiers knew that the Wehrmacht defenders, fanatical and well-trained, often played possum. A wounded foe lying in the deep grass was a trap waiting to spring. The directive that spread through the squads was not delivered by a general. It was a quiet, hardened consensus. You could not afford to leave a breathing weapon behind you. The units driving inland from the beaches faced an equally chilling equation. The drive toward the town of Carentan was a gauntlet of artillery craters and sniper fire. For the infantrymen of the 29th Division, the fight at the Vierville Draw was a frontline gauntlet. Communication with the fleet was sporadic, and the entire chain of command had been shattered. It was in this vacuum that the unwritten orders spread like a virus. Officers who in training had lectured on the proper handling of prisoners found themselves fighting a war of total destruction against a deeply entrenched enemy. When the German defenders in a shattered pillbox extended a white flag, the response from the exhausted, traumatized survivors on the ground was often met with a burst of sustained fire. The justification was immediate and practical. The Germans had used the white flag as a baiting tactic earlier that morning, felling American soldiers who stood up to accept the fake surrender. Trust had been eliminated. The shocked faces of the opposition were not seen as defeated men. They were seen as future combatants who would simply pick up a rifle the moment the Americans advanced past. To remove the obstacle, the men in the field chose to ensure the obstacle was permanently taken down. The underground nature of this directive is why it remains one of the most uncomfortable truths of the Second World War. Historians argue that the order to take no prisoners was never stamped by SHAF Supreme Headquarters. But in the oral histories of the men with the screaming eagles on their shoulders, the story is different. They speak in hushed tones about the briefing officers in England who, unable to state it explicitly, implied that carrying prisoners through the fluid front lines of the invasion would be catastrophic. The soldiers read between the lines. They understood that the airborne operation was a coup de main, a swift hand strike that relied on shock and velocity. A train of captured enemy soldiers shuffling down a dark lane would not only slow the advance, but would also attract artillery and machine gun fire from friendly planes mistaking the column for a counterattack. The Dark Order was a psychological contract. It absolved the men of the impossible guilt of failing their mission because of the cumbersome rules of engagement. The psychological toll was immediate. In the silence that followed the clearing of a farmhouse, young soldiers would find themselves trembling, not from fear of combat, but from the irreversible step they had taken into a moral void. The men of Easy Company, later immortalized, were some of the finest citizen soldiers the world has ever seen. Yet, in the quiet moments between the shelling, they faced the grim task of processing what necessity had forced them to become. The official uniform of the United States Army carried the weight of democratic values. But in the grime-soaked, intense corridors of Bricourt Manor, the rules were rewritten. As they neutralized a German battery firing down onto Utah Beach, the intensity of the assault left no room for nuance. The attack was a whirlwind of fragmentation grenades and screaming small arms fire. When the smoke cleared and the guns were silenced, the scene was one of overwhelming finality. The defenders had been swept aside with extreme prejudice. This was the reality of D-Day that newsreels would never show, the haunted, hollow look in the eyes of a liberator who had walked the line between justice and the abyss. As the day crawled towards afternoon, the separation between the Dark Order and standard military doctrine became permanently blurred. On Omaha, the casualty count on the sand had reached a catastrophic critical mass. Engineers trying to blow the obstacles blocking the beach exits were repeatedly cut down. Brigadier General Norman Cota, walking upright, cane in hand, screaming at men to move forward, knew that the only way to survive was to set the asphalt on fire. His famous command, "Rangers lead the way," was a euphemism for a brutal, straightforward truth. To lead was to destroy whatever was in the path. The Rangers climbing the sheer cliffs of Pointe du Hoc were not burdened with zip ties or holding cells. They were burdened with ropes, rockets, and a mission to dismantle a battery of 155 mm guns. Their climb was an act of desperate heroism. But the fight at the top was an act of silent, mutual elimination. The German defenders in the craters had no escape, and the Rangers, clinging to the edge of the continent, had no time. The resulting struggle was a primal, hand-to-hand surge where the loser vanished, and the winner crawled forward another inch. In the isolated drop zone south of Carentan, the men of the 82nd Airborne were fighting a phantom war in the marshlands. The flooding had turned the geography into a death trap. Paratroopers lost their lives in inches of water, unable to cut themselves free from their harnesses. Those who emerged found themselves in a silent world of tall reeds and eerie mist. It was here that the unwritten rule reached its most isolated and brutal expression. A glider trooper, his craft shattered into 1,000 splinters against a tree line, found himself face to face with an equally terrified young German conscript. The two teenagers stared at each other for a split second, the universal language of fear passing between them. But the sound of approaching tracked vehicles, the unmistakable clank of German panzers, broke the spell. The American could not risk a cry for help. He could not risk the Germans signaling his compatriots. The violent solution was instantaneous, a flash of steel in the moonlight that ended the standoff and plunged the young trooper back into the suffocating silence of the night. These were not stories of heroism. They were stories of unspeakable necessity, buried under the flag of liberation. The official Wehrmacht logs from June 6th and June 7th record a devastating anomaly. Entire platoons of the 352nd Infantry Division and the 91st Air Landing Division simply ceased to communicate. They were not captured. They were not overrun in a traditional sense. They were wiped from the grid. German commanders, bewildered by the speed of the collapse, assumed a communications breakdown. They failed to grasp that the American Airborne was moving with a terrifyingly efficient rule of engagement. Absolute clearance. The bunkers on the bluffs were not just assaulted. They were sealed. Gammon bombs and flamethrowers turned concrete strongholds into chambers of smoke and silence. When a German officer attempted to rally a retreat from the rearward trenches, he found the path blocked by the fallen bodies of his own signalmen, taken down by knifework so quiet that the rest of the unit hadn't even heard the struggle. The unspoken directive was not a sign of undisciplined rage. It was a cold, calculated tactical application designed to sow absolute psychological paralysis among the German defenders. This paralysis was exactly what the Allied High Command had hoped for, even if they couldn't admit it publicly. The success of D-Day depended on severing the nerves of the German command structure. Prisoner interrogations were an intelligence luxury, but the delay they caused was a tactical poison. As the 4th Infantry Division pushed inland from Utah, linking up with the airborne pockets, they crossed a landscape that had already been sanitized by the men from the sky. The road to Poupeville was littered with the burned-out husks of German vehicles. But noticeably absent were the clusters of surrendering men usually seen in a rout. The paratroopers had interpreted their mandate to secure the causeways as an order to leave nothing breathing in their wake. This scorched earth approach to human resources was the dark engine that made the rapid link-up possible. It prevented the chaos of the beachhead from boiling over, ensuring that the narrow exits from the sand were not clogged with the logistical nightmare of an enemy column marching rearward. As dusk finally settled over the battle-worn peninsula on the evening of June 6th, the worst of the clashes seemed to pause. The sounds of naval artillery shifted inland, and a strange, eerie quiet descended on the beaches. Men began the grim task of triaging the shattered and the stunned. It was in this fragile twilight that the final, most hidden aspect of the Dark Order took shape. There were no witness statements to file. The administrative chaos of the invasion provided a blanket of bureaucratic amnesia. The men who had executed the brutal necessities of the morning simply logged it under the generic cover of enemy resistance overcome. There were no tribunals, no inquiries. The culture of silence was self-enforcing. Soldiers who had shared a foxhole with the moral horror of that morning swore a private oath. They knew that what happened in the drowning marshes and the burning bunkers was not the way of the citizen soldier, but the way of the beast that war had briefly unleashed and demanded. The survivors cleaned their rifle barrels and stared at the horizon, saying nothing. 1 week later, the beachhead was secure. Generals toured the terrain in jeeps, and journalists began composing the legend of the greatest day. The war correspondents, huddled in their tents, typed out stories of chivalry and courageous charges. They wrote about the long lines of German prisoners being marched onto LSTs for transport to England. And yes, there were thousands of prisoners taken in the days following the invasion, a testament that the Dark Order was not a permanent policy, but a situational collapse of morality born from a very specific window of terror. But those thousands of survivors did not erase what the first wave had done to stitch the beachhead together. The unspoken directive had calcified into a bitter memory. It was the shadow that walked beside the bayonet, a truth that Medal of Honor citations would elegantly omit. The cost of liberation was not just measured in the American lives that vanished into the French soil, but in the brutal, haunting efficiency that had cleared the path. The legacy of June 6, 1944 is a double-edged sword. We build monuments to the boys who stormed the sand, and we cry at the footage of the white crosses on the bluffs. But we rarely peer into the abyss that those boys were ordered to inhabit. The Dark Order of D-Day remains unspoken, not because it is a secret, but because it is a wound that refuses to heal. It is the ghost in the machine of the Grand Crusade. To acknowledge it is to accept that even the justest of wars requires its righteous soldiers to touch the darkest parts of the human soul. The men who dropped into that pitch-black countryside didn't just break the Atlantic Wall. They broke a piece of themselves, sacrificing their innocence for a foothold that would change the world. And in the quiet of the Norman cemeteries, the wind still whispers the unspoken directive, a chilling reminder that survival is sometimes forged not in the capturing, but in the letting go.